Meridian, Mississippi were just enjoying their Saturday night dinner when they looked outside and they saw their cars disappear. This hole was outside a brand new IHOP. 12 cars in all fell right into that 30-foot wide hole. The good news is that no one was hurt, but obviously this is very interesting to figure out what happened here. There's been some debate over whether this is technically a sinkhole. The public safety director calls it an accident. And joining me now to get to the bottom of this is Patrick Abbott. He's a professor of geology at San Diego State University. So, Mr. Abbott, explain this to us. What happened here and why do you say this is not a sinkhole?
Well, this is not like what we were used to, like what happened in Florida that took a house down, or in Kentucky where the Corvette Museum disappeared into a limestone cave. You can see the linear trench, the even walls, the width. And when you look carefully at the pictures of the walls, you can see the layering in sand layers. You can see weak, loose sand. I think what's happened here is the present has run into the past. That was probably a drainage culvert or some sort of a pipe underneath. Water moving underground has moved a lot of those loose sand grains, and now with construction and the weight of cars, kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, the ground collapsed.
Is this a freak accident, or is this something that you think could have been prevented?
This definitely could have been prevented, but the trick is, we can be having some of this erosion going underground. In other words, these cities have past to them. We can go way back in the past and say, well, they had a drainage ditch here sometime, 80 years ago or something or other, and it's maybe lost to memory. And so if you don't know it's there, or there's no record that something like that formerly existed, you're inheriting problems from what folks did a long time ago.
So who needs to deal with this, and how do you make sure that this doesn't happen, right there in the immediate area? Could this get worse?
Well, certainly it looks like it could continue on. We see about a 600-foot length, a nice parallel walls along a human-dug trench. And how much farther does it go? Well, we don't know now, but of course now people are aware of the existence of this, and you ought to maybe do some drilling to see if you encounter this real loose sediment someplace else, and also try to figure out what it was. Was this some drainage system that has branches in it, other areas that might collapse now in the future? But, Meridian's an old town. We're going way back into the 1800s, and a lot of things have been dug and reburied during that time, and it's hard to know all the things that...
New video of what the significant rains did earlier on Monday in Ashkelon, Israel. This caused a sinkhole. You could see that road was completely swallowed up through there. Cars submerged, and people were floating on rafts to maneuver through the high water within the city of Ashkelon. You can see those are rescuers there trying to get to people. The flooding unfortunately reached a hospital within the city where they were postponing surgeries until the situation got better under control, and they were waiting for that flood water to recede. So huge problems there with roads collapsing as well as cars being submerged. What a mess.
flare that occurred last week over a 30-hour period from November 3rd through the 5th. The close-up video shows an active region near the right-hand edge of the sun's disk, which erupted with at least a dozen minor events. Following a solar flare, it takes the charged particles about 40 hours to reach the Earth's atmosphere. Of course, all of this can't be seen with the naked eye, but we couldn't even see the sun in the southeast, so.
This morning, we are getting our first look at the moment an officer fires shots at a woman who tried to run him over with an SUV. This happened in Sand Springs, Oklahoma on Friday afternoon. The police department released this video yesterday to demonstrate why the officer opened fire. Incredibly, that officer was not seriously injured. A woman was taken into custody where she admitted that she had recently smoked meth.
Taser, taser, taser! I can't bust through the window. But you got anything to bust it? No, I don't. Get an ass on you? Nope. Is no one bust the fucking window out? Watch out. Do not move! I can't see her at all. She's down in the floorboard. She moving? No, I'm going down. Hang on. Let me cover you. Okay. Let me cover you. Get the door. Get the door. Come on. Got less police on you. Hands right now. Okay. They have not advised that yet. No, they're good. Everything's good back there.
One of America's busiest airports is back up and running this morning after security scare left it paralyzed. Heavily armed officers searched at least one plane at Miami International last night after reports of a suspicious item. Parts of the airport were locked down while the FBI investigated. Dozens of flights were delayed. Chris Van Cleve is in Washington with the alarming disruption. Chris, good morning.
Good morning. The FBI says a passenger went through security and something in his luggage raised a red flag, but that passenger was allowed to board a plane. He was removed from that flight and questioned by authorities. They then determined the item was not dangerous and he was let go, but not before hundreds of passengers were impacted.
Everybody out. Everybody out. From the front. From the front. Everybody out.
Startled passengers inside this plane at Miami International Airport were ordered to place their hands on their heads and evacuate as heavily armed police searched this American Airlines flight. Sections of one of the world's busiest airports were shut down for hours as the FBI investigated the security threat.
I just seen different police officers. They've been out here and they walking around with M16s, assault rifles. Like, it's kind of scary.
Video shows a man in a red shirt being led away in handcuffs, but the FBI says the passenger who raised suspicions was not arrested and will not face any criminal charges.
They came in and told everybody to get out. The airport was being evacuated, so we all came outside and we've been sitting here ever since.
But as police swept the airport, 50 flights were delayed, another 9 were diverted. Several people were locked inside this restaurant with the gates closed during the police search. Displaced passengers missed several flights.
Long lines, my flight's probably delayed. Let's see if we can even get on a flight. Let's see if I even leave tonight. So it's a big headache.
The FBI says the passenger they detained was cooperative during questioning. Nora?
All right, Chris, thank you so much.
reports are giving some insight into the effects of global warming. And as you can imagine, the news isn't good. The growing threat could cause sea levels to rise, flooding major cities across the globe. It's a story we first told you about yesterday morning, but we wanted to look a little deeper to see what that would mean for folks here in Connecticut. News 8's Brian Spyros is live in West Haven this morning with a look at all of that. Good morning, Brian.
Well, good morning, Marisol. These reports are out ahead of a United Nations meeting that is set to take place the end of this month in France on this very topic. And the goal is to prevent sea level rise along many coastal areas around the world. And obviously with something like that, if something like that happened here in Connecticut, it would be detrimental because of our shoreline. Now, the main issue here are these carbon emissions. There's a great deal of science behind it all. But basically what's happening is it's warming up the atmosphere and causing ice to melt. That in turn causes sea levels to rise, which they are already doing. Now, this is bad news considering that half of the world's population lives along coastal areas. If sea levels rose by several feet, it would force hundreds of millions of people to abandon their homes and move further inland to already populated areas. And that would be the case here in our state from Greenwich all the way to Stonington. I spoke with Professor Tate at Southern Connecticut State University, and he gave some insight into all of this.
This is something that we have to live with. It's something that we have to plan for. But the problem is that people use that uncertainty to say, well, since we don't know, let's not get all excited about it and not do anything about it. Let's wait and see.
Now, the predictions are right now that if we don't do anything about these carbon emissions, sea levels would rise by several feet by the start of the next century. Professor Tate says we are quickly reaching a tipping point. We need to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that are going into the atmosphere, and that is going to be the focus of that United Nations meeting, again scheduled to start on November 30th in France. We are reporting live this morning from West Haven. I'm Brian Spyros. Keith, we'll send it back to you.
A great mystery
in
at Egypt's Great Pyramid of Giza. Thermal scans indicating something strange going on behind those 4,500-year-old walls. Preservation experts found temperature variations. Temperature variations between adjacent stones were typically less than a half a degree, but then there was a 6-degree variation on a section of the pyramid's eastern wall. Experts really aren't sure why. They say that it could be a secret passage, a hidden chamber, or just a different type of stone. At the very least, they say it could shed additional light on how the pyramids were constructed.
It was an incident of blatant racism caught on camera. 2 students expelled and the Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapter at the University of Oklahoma shut down in March. And there are other cases of racial tension sparking outrage on campuses across the country. After days of protests, the University of Missouri's president, Tim Wolf, forced to step down following a hunger strike by a student and a threatened boycott by the school's football team after Wolf did little to respond to several racially charged incidents on campus, including a swastika drawn in feces at a campus dorm.
We out here, we've been here, we ain't leaving, we are love.
Protests also erupting this week at Yale after an SAE fraternity member allegedly blocked a student from going into a house party because she wasn't white. SAE denies the allegations. Last month, a Kanye West-themed party thrown by a fraternity at UCLA sparked protests after some partygoers allegedly wore blackface. In 2014, a gangster-themed party with racial overtones at the SAE house at Clemson University led to that chapter also closing its doors. Some racially charged incidents have been more threatening. In 2014, the Sigma Phi Epsilon fraternity at the University of Mississippi was shut down after 3 members tied a noose around a statue of the school's first black student.
It takes a moment where things come to a head for us to really say, oh, something's going on.
NYU professor and University of Oklahoma alum Charlton McElwain says racial tensions on college campuses are not new and often don't get the attention they deserve.
I really think that the problem is always there, and I think that part of the problem that folks on college campuses make, administrators, presidents, and otherwise, is to think that there's nothing going on and that these things kind of suddenly come out of the blue, when in actuality they're there if folks are listening.
Gosh, what a terrifying moment there. This was actually the real moment of impact. This one was Snapchatting right as a small jet that was carrying 9 people careened into a residential building in Akron, Ohio yesterday. Unfortunately, all 9 people aboard were killed. This was a private jet for PEB Enterprises, which is a real estate developer company. 9 total were killed, 7 employees, 2 crew members. You know, luckily for her, the woman that was Snapchatting, she was in the building next door, and actually nobody was in the building that the plane hit, so there were no casualties on the ground. Now, at the time, the weather conditions were very poor. We had low visibility, there was fog around, low ceilings, things like that. Now, of course, the investigation is going to have to determine whether that was actually a factor in the crash or not, but certainly something that needs to be looked at closely.
However it happened, the management, the top management of the companies, BHP Billiton, have taken this with quite rightly grave seriousness.
Well, Richard, they have. There have been plenty of complaints about how long it has taken some authorities to react. However, though, just the pain and the despair when rescue workers were initially searching for survivors has really turned into outright anger here in Brazil. Not so much with BHP, but with the federal government, with the other company that owns Samarco. We're talking about Brazil's Vale. There were questions about why the CEO wasn't on the site immediately. Why hasn't the president of Brazil visited the site? And people do want to know what caused this. Why wasn't there a warning system? What's going to be done to stop this? These are unanswered questions. We're now a week from that initial tragedy, and as you mentioned, now they're ordering new evacuations concerned over a 3rd dam. This is obviously really angering people here in the country, because not only was it not prevented, but now we're looking at possibly even greater repercussions. The federal government has responded saying they're going to send in the environmental minister to check out the damage. And remember, these are waste dams. This is wastewater. The sludge is still continuing downstream, contaminating rivers and actually damaging the water supply systems in the state of Minas Gerais that's already suffering a severe drought. So I think at this point, we've obviously got to continue talking about the human loss. The people want, if they can't have their family members back, they do want the bodies recovered. So there is a human tragedy here, but we're also looking at a much bigger environmental and health hazard. We still don't know the full dimensions of it, Richard.
Now, that health hazard, when you say we don't know the dimensions, is this because of the contamination that was in that wastewater? And do we have any idea of what contaminants are involved?
You know, we don't have all of those details, and what BHP and Vale said in their joint statement today is they want to continue to focus on the consequences of this accident and of providing help. But at this point, they're still not going into great detail about what the damage could be, about what caused it, and there is going to be a lot more finger pointing. We haven't seen, as I said, the president of the country move in. There is going to be a lot of who's going to take care of this, who's going to do what. The companies say that they've created an emergency fund to help the families that have been affected, to rebuild the communities. But again, there has been a certain slowness in the response, Richard, from the local official, from the
Russian Black Sea resort of Sochi was hit by massive floodings after heavy rains in the area. Flooding has forced Russian President Vladimir Putin to postpone a meeting involving doping allegations in a recent World Anti-Doping Agency Commission report.
Long-delayed missile deal between Russia and Iran is seeing renewed life. Moscow says it has signed a contract to deliver S-300 surface-to-air missile systems to Tehran. The defensive systems were first promised 8 years ago. Russia and Iran have sealed the deal for Moscow to supply Tehran with S-300 surface-to-air missile systems. The exact delivery date remains unclear, but experts in Russia say the first systems could be in place in about 18 months. The $800 million missile contract was originally signed in 2007, but Russia froze the deliveries in 2010 due to United Nations sanctions against Iran over its nuclear program. Moscow lifted its freeze in April following an interim nuclear deal between Tehran and world powers. Israel, the US and Saudi Arabia are all opposed to the contract. Israel and the US do not want to give Iran greater defensive capabilities.
Syrian government forces, backed by Russian airstrikes, have broken a siege imposed by the Islamic State group on a northern military airbase since 2013. Syrian state TV says dozens of IS fighters were killed in the battle near Aleppo, and hundreds of dead extremists were found around the compound. It marks the first major achievement by President Bashar al-Assad's troops since Russia began its air campaign in Syria in late September. Now, IS had besieged the base for more than 2 years. The Syrian government forces inside managed to repel attack after attack, knowing they would be tortured, then probably beheaded if captured alive. Experts say the breakthrough should mean Syrian forces can advance into IS-held areas around Aleppo.
We're in Trenton, Missouri, where it's windy, like it is across much of eastern Kansas and western Missouri. We had even stronger winds earlier in the day. Let me take you back to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Eastern portions of Mercer County, about 9 miles due east of Princeton on 136 highway. This is where we encountered winds that had to be at least 70 miles per hour, at the very least 70 miles per hour. We've been in a lot of thunderstorms, and these were some of the strongest winds that I've ever personally experienced. It looked a lot like video that you would see from the south along the Gulf Coast for a hurricane. Visibility reduced down to 0 at times. We had to pull off to the side of the road and put our four-ways on. It was tremendous wind, and at times we thought that it was much stronger than 70 miles per hour. Fortunately, we were not able to find any damage in that part of Mercer County or any significant damage back here in the town of Trenton, but there was a whole lot of damage sporadically back in Kansas City with non-thunderstorm related wind gusts. Brian, I want to take you back to earlier this afternoon at 2:30 when we tracked a tornado-warned thunderstorm in Mercer County over the town of Princeton. Take a look at this video. Again, this was from 2:30 this afternoon. Thankfully, this did not produce a tornado. At least we haven't received any reports, and I could not confirm a tornado touchdown at this time. But what we did have there is what you're looking at is a rotating wall cloud. That's the part of the storm has a rain-free brace where the air is rising from the surface up into the base of the thunderstorm, and that whole cloud feature is rotating. If there was going to be a tornado with that storm, it was going to be in that part of the cloud that we were tracking earlier today. That was the only tornado-warned thunderstorm in our 44 viewing county, and we were on it earlier today at 2:30. Again, thankfully, it did not produce a tornado, but we did have some wind damage from that storm. Likewise, back in the metro, we had winds estimated here in Mercer County of 60 to 70 miles per hour. Brian, back to you.